So as we continue in this idea, I want to also take you now, not from this idea of what seems unjust or unfair or how we deal with these things, but I just want to pull us back into this concept of how suffering has a place in the life of the Christian. Because we seem to be very suffering averse. One of the questions that we get asked as people who go on missions is it safe? Well, we tend to chuckle at such things because is it safe for us to go check our mail in our mailbox today? Is it safe to drive to work? Are schools safe? And sometimes it seems as though we are looking for how we can most possibly avoid anything that makes us even uncomfortable, much less how we might suffer for the name of Christ. But remember this, in the scriptures, the apostles, when they endured suffering, rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. I wonder if we might have such a mindset to actually be willing to embrace the idea of suffering and rejoice that we were counted worthy to endure something akin to the suffering of Christ in order to bring him glory, in order to be useful. So remember that 1 Peter tells us that this is part of walking in the footsteps of Christ. That Christ is our example. He suffered for us, and we too will be called to suffering. Remember, as we look at these passages like Matthew chapter 5, 2 Peter 2, Revelation 2:9, if you want to look those up, God allows suffering of Christ's followers as a means to seal, stay with me, seal the testimony of Christ's eternal worth and value to the lost. He uses it as a witness against the unbelieving, even to show that their condemnation is just. In other words, the way that we are treated as strangers and aliens in this world gives witness both to the fact that Jesus is worth following no matter what, and as a witness against those who persecute us and cause us suffering and harm, who do evil to us, that on the day in which their works are judged, that their condemnation is just. Difficult concept to grab a hold of. It also is used, as we see in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, that this is to produce Christ-likeness in us. That there are things about you right now that just aren't like Jesus. And while some things may form in you like Christ through blessing and answered prayers and abundance or more comfort or all the things you want, there are some things that can't form like Christ in you without having some things taken from you, without some things being difficult, without there being a need to endure, without having to do without having to suffer. And so suffering can have a place in your life as a believer in order to better form the image of Christ in you, because there's stuff in the way. There's things that you won't die to in order to be more like Christ, which is for your good. Christ-likeness is for your good. And in order to get you more into the good purposes God has planned for you and the works that he's prepared for you before the foundation of the world, he's got to get his sandpaper out and do some work. He's got to get his chisel out and do some work. He's got to take away some things you're depending on that are in the way of you depending on him. He's got to bring you sometimes to the end of even yourself, your pride, perhaps even some of your passions and pursuits, so that you will see that Christ is what you're really after. Again, we are strangers and aliens, and we're not of this world. Christ is our master, and this suffering can quite often be the very thing that proves that to the world around us because of how we handle it, how we endure, how we go through these things. You know, when you think of someone like Stephen being stoned by this mob of people who thought they were on God's side, who were thinking they were champions for God and the upholders and protectors of the faith, who were actually going in the very opposite direction of what God wanted. You see a man who says, like Christ, at the end of his life, as he's being stoned, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, just like Jesus had. We see a man who reveals, even shining on his face, beholding the glory of God, as that account gives us in, I believe, Acts chapter 7. We see something like this taking place, and we realize that This had to have had a dramatic impact on the life of someone named Saul, who had the coats of the men stoning Stephen laid at his feet. That must have been something in the back of his mind when he finally does come face to face with Jesus on the road to Damascus. It wasn't just the shining bright light and the encounter and the words of Jesus that had to be on his mind, but how many did he murder? How many did he cast in prison? How many did he take lands and possessions? How many people and families did he break apart? The suffering of those had to be one of the greatest points, one of the most convicting things that led to recognizing that the Jesus he was hearing from, the one who was Lord, had to be the one that he was also going to be worth suffering for. The suffering of others led to a willingness in his life to also suffer. And indeed, when he was called, we see the description. Jesus himself says, I will show him how much he will suffer for my name's sake. I believe because he saw the suffering of others that this Jesus was worth it. He had a much greater sense of and value on suffering himself for the sake of Christ. Ultimately, again, let's remember that we do serve a God who has not fully revealed all of his will. We serve a God who is sovereign, who is bigger, whose ways are higher than our ways, whose thoughts are higher than our thoughts, whose wisdom is well and far beyond ours, whose scope and plan and purposes are from before the foundation of the world and far into eternity in ways you and I could not even begin to comprehend. And we can trust him. We can entrust, again I say it, entrust our souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is ultimately right. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 19. So I have to remind us of the big perspective, bring us back as we close up this concept of suffering to this particular passage, Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. Through the middle of the street of the city also, on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Verse 3 says, no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And night will be no more. They will need no lamp or light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. There's coming a day in which this space, this time, this eternity with him, there will be no more suffering. He will indeed wipe away every tear from our eyes. Suffering, nothing accursed. That day is coming. And imagine, it has no end. We will reign with him forever and ever. And as Psalm 86:9 says, all the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. Can you imagine the scales for just a moment again, with all these ways in which God may be working through various forms of suffering that seem to us right now to be unjust or unfair or without purpose? And can you weigh them against God's eternal purposes and recognize that God does have truly a great plan at work, and that he will not waste anything being experienced through these hours and days of suffering, or years even? Can we also see that when it comes to what is unjust truly, as man does his inhumanity to man, as evil and sin and death occur in this cursed fallen world, sin-fallen world, that it breaks the heart of God to the extent that he was willing to sacrifice his own son to redeem us, and not just us, but all of creation? Can we recognize that this horrible, unjust place, full of darkness and suffering and evil and death, etc., is a place that God himself endured much suffering in order to redeem, in order to bring back into what he intended and even better? So, as you consider all these areas of suffering, I may not have touched on all the areas in which you are currently facing this in your life. I hope We've given you some things to really consider and think about with what you see in the world. And I hope that the bottom line is that you can trust him, that you can keep following him through what you're experiencing, that maybe he's calling you to act in some way with compassion or justice, to come to the aid of some, to give the gospel to some, to maybe ask hard questions even to some, but ultimately to shine as lights in the world amidst these dark things, and to know that he's worth following no matter what. Again, my name is Rob Casey. This is a Missions Moment series on suffering from GoSendMe Global. I hope this is a good help to you and a good preparation for you with what you're going to experience on your mission field or right where you live now. If you have more questions about that, want to talk, or maybe we didn't hit on something that you needed us to, or maybe you have a question or something that you'd like to bring out of this and go further with, we'd love to hear from you. You can email me at rcasey@gosendme.us, or you can leave a comment here on this video. We'd love to hear from you. God bless you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.